Thanks for coming out. So for this talk, I'm gonna walk through how to really build a data-driven organization and what that means, and then also try to give a view into what sorts of data you should look at various stages in your game's life cycle. I generally hate talking about myself, but I was advised I should do a little bit of a background just so you guys know whether or not you should listen or sort of throw out whatever I say. So my name is Josh. Done a couple startups that were data oriented before Contagion. My first startup was actually in finance, so working with folks in Wall Street and in Chicago. We had the largest database of derivatives information in the world, and sold data to hedge funds and institutional investors, and helped them make a bunch of money trading options and such. And we sold that company in 2002, early 2003. I was CTO there, and we used data every day and saw it, used in real time to make big, important financial decisions. After that, I was CEO at a company called Garage Games, and we made game technology, powered a lot of casual games, and we're here in the early days of casual connects here in Seattle and in Amsterdam, and always had a fun time with it. We also distributed games and looked at data daily to try to help developers optimize their games. And of course, at Contagion, we see data every day across a broad spectrum of games. So we have customers in social games, in online free-to-play games, and now a lot of customers in mobile games too. We're primarily focused on enterprise, so larger companies with larger apps generating significant revenues on any of those three platforms. So I'll try to share a view into what we've seen be successful across all those platforms in terms of how you look at data and what to measure. And in general, just share some thoughts on how to build a data-driven organization, really for any company, but for games in particular. I think it goes without saying today that being data-driven is important. You really have to look at data. A lot of companies, treat data as their lifeblood, and encourage their teams to look at data daily, or as Jill said, multiple times a day. And we see those are the companies that really do the best over time. I think that's certainly been proven in social games, where Zynga really kind of set the bar for what it means to be data-driven, and it's becoming more and more true in mobile games as well. A good friend and mentor of mine named Jeff Donnell has a mobile studio now, and calls releasing games into the App Store without data just sort of playing App Store roulette, and I think he's exactly right. It's if you don't have a plan for how you're going to launch your game, acquire users, and iterate it through live development to improve it and make it a better and better player experience, using data every step of the way, you really are just kind of placing a bet and hoping that you get lucky. And even if you do get lucky with an initial game, if you have a great design, you put it out there and it gets some traction, without using data, once you have an audience, using data becomes really important to keep that audience engaged and to optimize the game over time. If you don't do that, you're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table, generally leaving audiences undiscovered, and you're leaving yourself open to a threat of competition. For better or worse, we live in an industry where copycatting is common, and if you have a great design and you're not using data to try to optimize your player base and your game, you're susceptible to a competitor coming in with a very similar design and using data to go find broader audiences and target them better. So with that, I'll quickly walk through an agenda. I'd like to talk about what it means to be data-driven, and I'll go fast since we only have 20 minutes. Talk about why it's important to look at data throughout the life cycle of your game and what that means, and then specifically like what data to look at. How do you make decisions at different points in your game's development cycle and your audience curve to make decisions about whether to launch a game initially, what sorts of users to try to acquire when you are launching, and how to optimize a game's economics over time. And I'll also talk a little bit about why it's hard, especially in spaces like mobile, and then some quick takeaways. So what does it mean to be data-driven? It's really a continuous cycle of improving your game. You are constantly observing player behavior, coming up with hypotheses, testing those hypotheses, observing results of those hypotheses, and iterating on releases to improve the game, all with the goal of creating a better player experience over time. Really requires you to be rigorous about the way you measure data and collect data. But being data-driven, has a specific purpose. It's not just to look at data. You're really trying to fundamentally improve your game and your business. So overall, that means growing your audience while minimizing your customer acquisition costs, as well as maximizing your LTV. So that's keeping players around longer, keeping them engaged more and more deeply, and ultimately getting them to spend more money and share the game with their friends. Now, at Contagion, we've seen, again, we've worked with a lot of customers really closely and tried to boil down best practices around being data-driven and how to look at data. And we capture this most broadly in what we call the ARM funnel. And you can see it here. It's a way to look at acquisition metrics, retention metrics, and monetization metrics. And what's really important to notice here is that viral sources and social loops amongst your player base are accounted for in this funnel, where you have players inviting their friends to a game or playing with their friends in matches or cooperatively. And you need to observe not only your sources of acquisition and where users are coming from, but how players are interacting with each other. And ultimately, data coming out the bottom of the funnel about which users are retained and how those users are retained and which users monetize and how well they monetize needs to feed back into the top of the funnel where you're doing acquisition. And we'll talk about some of that, such that you can identify the best performing users for your particular game, find your audience, and then figure out how to target them most effectively through your acquisition channels, be they paid or organic or viral. Focusing on the right acquisition, retention, and monetization metrics is really the difference between success or failure in being data-driven and using data to build successful games. And that's something at Contagion, certainly we try to help customers understand. And whether you use Contagion or another service or do everything in-house, being very precise about what you measure will be a big determinant of success and whether you really capture the opportunity for your game. To walk through this a little bit in terms of how you use data throughout a game's life cycle, we put together this little graph, which we'll kind of walk through. Because apps today, whether they're an online game that's free to play or a social game or a mobile game, do have a life cycle. On the x-axis here, we have time, so measuring from the beginning of your game's development and launch onward through its life cycle and maturity. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, we have your total active user base at any given time. And what happens, of course, is you start off in testing, and in this phase, you look at different sorts of data, and we'll walk through this. Than you do later on when your game starts to mature. But after you test, you want to look for indicators that your game is ready to launch, and there we really focus on retention measures and engagement measures. And again, we'll walk through that. But after you get through beta test, you then launch, and this is really where you focus on acquisition and beginning to acquire users and understanding your unit economics for acquiring users. So how much does it cost you to acquire a user, which sorts of users appear to be best fit for your game and stick around the longest, monetize the best, and then how can you find more of those users more effectively. Once you figure that out, you go into the real growth phase. If you're confident your unit economics work on the user acquisition side, you can start to scale, invest in user acquisition, and really grow your audience. If you tune it as well, of course you can test and optimize your viral and social channels for organic user growth, and that's an additional area of importance in this growth phase. But like really any business, eventually you reach a point of maturity and then eventual decline for most applications. And in this phase, it becomes really important to optimize, again, for retention and also to optimize for monetization. Once you have that big audience and you know you're close to reaching your total market size. And it also becomes important in this phase, especially as your user base starts to decline, to measure your efficacy in cross-promoting users to other games, hopefully that you have in development and ready to start scaling. So again, we'll walk through what you look at in each of these cycles, but data-driven development really involves all three of the broad topics we've discussed thus far. And companies like Zynga, Kabam, Peak Games, King.com, Pocket Gems really take being data-driven to heart and build cultures around it. So they have mantras like data wins arguments. They constantly are testing and measuring data and using it to make decisions, and they empower their product teams, their designers, their marketing teams, and their even support and operations teams with data to make better and better decisions over time. And really baking that into culture and the way you operate your games is very important if you're going to be serious about data. And we certainly see that in the social game space. We're seeing that more and more in the mobile game space. And I think it's just being proven out over time. And logically, this makes sense. If you really are data-driven, we go back to kind of your life cycle graph here, we'll take a look at kind of what happens, and we see this with customers that are data-driven versus not data-driven. So we'll call these companies Data Co and Cowboy Co. So in the early phases, being data-driven doesn't, you don't see much difference. You don't have very much audience. But the difference in this phase is that data-driven companies are actively collecting data, carefully measuring it, getting their teams oriented around using data to make decisions. And in this phase, data-driven companies will use early indicators of player behavior to decide when and how to launch. Whereas less data-driven companies will observe some player behavior, do some level of beta testing, and ultimately decide a little more on gut when the right time to launch is. As opposed to looking at metrics and measuring their unit economics. As you continue on into launch, again, their differences don't start to show too much yet in data-driven companies versus non-data-driven companies. Again, in this phase, you're just trying to find your audience and identify really your unit economics. So you can get by without being too data-driven. But in this phase, differences do start to show. I mean, if you are very data-driven, and you compare two companies that launch on the same day, one that's data-driven, one that isn't, already on day 2, the data-driven company will be observing which sorts of players perform best in their game, which ad channels those players came from, which campaigns were most effective for identifying those players and acquiring them cheaply, and they'll be looking for early experience problems like their tutorial completion funnel, or their early user experience, and even their day 1 retention, and making active decisions on the marketing and even the product or the game side to drive development forward. And you flow that through onto a game's life cycle such that by week 2 into launch, the data-driven company has a much better sense of what their audience looks like and how to find those users over time, such that by the time you start the real growth phase, data-driven companies are able to, more efficiently acquire users and keep them around longer and ultimately get them to spend more. And at the end of the day, they end up making, I think, better games too, at least if they do more than optimize just for short-term monetization. And that's a mistake I think we see. I mean, it's a profitable mistake. You can make money this way, but we see a lot of companies focus, just on short-term monetization and hitting users up for money immediately. But we think companies that do the best job actually optimize for real engagement and game quality and player retention. And that pays off throughout really a game's life cycle. And this isn't just theoretical, although hopefully it makes logical sense. We actually see this in real-world data. So this is an aggregation of about 50 games. We looked at it Contagion, successful games and failed games, and really the way that companies operate internally. And you can see here real-world data that speaks to the point we kind of talked about theoretically a moment ago. This is a normalized curve, so what we're measuring here is days since launch on the horizontal axis, and then the y-axis is peak daily active users as a percentage of peak DAU for a game, and we had to do that normalized because there's such wide variance in peak DAU we couldn't show absolute numbers. So you can see the shape is similar. They're both peak out at 100% obviously because that's on a per game basis. This measures on a relative basis. But the shape of the curve is the same. And ultimately the failed games that aren't data driven end up with smaller user bases that they don't keep as long as more data driven companies, and they end up monetizing a lot less as well. So we see this in practice every day at Contagion and really try to help our customers understand how to put this data into practice. And that's what we'll talk about now. What do you look at in each of the phases of your game's life cycle? Again, what you measure really matters and sort of determines what how your game is going to evolve. So it's really important to choose the right metrics to look at in each phase of development. Mike Segal is is a CEO at Gaia. He's one of the smartest guys I think in the whole industry, and he has a good story he tells about using analytics to make game decisions and marketing decisions and operations decisions. He said when he was learning to ski, his instructor told him, your skis will take you wherever you're looking. So whichever direction you're looking, that's where you're going to end up skiing. And he says, data in games is the same way. Whatever metrics you're focused on will determine how your game evolves and what your team ends up building over time. Therefore, it's really important to look at the right metrics at each phase of your game. And what we've learned over time working with customers closely is that during the early phases when you're deciding when and how to launch your game, it's most important to look at retention and engagement metrics. And during the launch phase, again, you really want to focus on acquisition metrics and proving out that you can scale your user base effectively, cost effectively. When you're in the real growth phase, then both acquisition and retention become important. And you also, of course, want to be looking at monetization, but it's not your focus at that time as an organization. Better, we found, to focus on the retention and acquisition side during the hyper-growth phase when you're really building an audience and investing in acquisition. And then as you start to reach maturity or you begin to reach your total audience size, it becomes important to focus very much on monetization, as well as still retention and trying to hold on to your players longer and re-engage players that might have fallen off. So we'll talk in a little more detail about each of these phases, starting first with the beta and launch phase. Again, we only have 20 minutes, so I'll go quickly here. But there's a lot more detail, and love to follow up with folks here at the show. This is a view for looking at really your acquisition and retention data together. One thing we encourage our customers to do, and even if you're using internal tools or other analytics providers, really encourage you to look at all your ad traffic sources, all your sources of acquisition, compare those to your organic sources and viral sources, and compare not just conversion rates and costs of acquisition, which is the way a lot of people operate, but couple that source data, the acquisition source data, with longer-term in-app behavior data for the players that came through those specific channels. So what that means is measuring indicators like day 1 retention and day 7 retention for user segments that came in through different ad channels or that clicked on various ad campaigns. This is challenging to do in general. It's very challenging to do in mobile, but it's a problem that can be solved, and of course something we try to do at Contagion and definitely encourage everyone to do. You also want to look early on at other indicators here about really what players are doing in-game and how users that came in through, say, one ad or one ad network or ad channel compare, not just on retention, but other engagement metrics like average session length and session frequency, so sessions per day. And if you optimize this way early on, what you're able to really determine is which sorts of users, based on your ad campaigns and ad targeting data, end up sticking around in your game the longest, sharing it the most with their friends, playing the most, and ultimately that's a good predictor of longer-term monetization behavior. So you can use this data to make rapid decisions about what your audience looks like and how to find them most profitably. One thing we really encourage folks to look at is actually to move beyond CPI. Everybody talks about CPI and cost per install, and that's an important way to structure many campaigns on Facebook as well as in mobile today. But unfortunately, we think people really get stuck just at the CPI level, and what you really need to look at is actually PPI, or profit per install. So what we encourage folks to do is look at particular segments or cohorts of users that come in through a given ad campaign or ad channel. Look not just at the CPI or cost of acquiring those installs and users, but couple that with in-app revenue data and other monetization data to get early indicators of revenue per user, and then build out both direct revenue that you're collecting from those users and a prediction, a reasonable prediction about how those users will perform over time based on your past experience or historic data, and use that to determine direct PPI and predicted PPI, or profit per install. Making decisions this way, it makes sense, but it's actually shocking how few game companies do this really effectively. The reason is, I think it's hard to couple this data together, but whereas it's easy to just set up a CPI campaign. But the problem today is a lot of the industry, and probably a lot of folks in the room, look at, say, a $1.50 CPI versus a 75-cent CPI and think 75-cent CPIs are better. But at the end of the day, that's not really enough data to make a decision. If you're making $3 in total revenue from the users that you acquired for $1.50 versus $1.50 from users you acquired for 75 cents, obviously the higher CPI would actually be more profitable. And depending on your revenue curve, the break-even time might even be shorter in this phase. So we really encourage people, again, to look at PPI per cohort, per segment when you're doing user acquisition. And we think this is the key, boil it down to one thing, key indicator when you're in the early launch phase and trying to determine your audience segment and what can be, which sorts of users are most profitable and how you can acquire them, and whether you should continue to invest in acquiring users for your game or not. So this is a very important metric and sort of way we try to encourage, and we hope to see more of the industry doing user acquisition over time. So for acquisition metrics, again, you want to identify profitable user segments and figure out how you can acquire those users most effectively. And you want to look at your acquisition cost per channel, your ARPU per channel, per segment, per cohort, and compare that to the acquisition cost to get a sense for profit per segment. And you need to empower really your marketing teams with all that data so that they can make decisions effectively in real time as they're operating ads across all the channels. Of course, in the early phases of beta and launch, you also want to be looking at virality and organic growth sources, both on social and mobile, and that's where optimizing things like rank campaigns on mobile can be important. But when you look at things based on PPI, you can sometimes choose perhaps a lower CPI or cost per install to try to drive a higher chart position with the same ad spend. But when you look at things on a PPI basis, you can very clearly make that trade-off between going for chart and rank and trying to drive more organic installs versus purely trying to find the highest ROI for your paid users. So you can make those decisions very clearly and empower your marketing teams to do so. And again, we're seeing people do a phenomenal job of this in mobile today, but the practice just isn't widespread enough yet, so we hope more people will. As you move past the launch phase, again, this is when you've determined your game is in good shape and you're ready to invest and really scale. It becomes important to look at deeper acquisition and retention metrics. There becomes a natural shift here to trying to, not just identify your profitable segments of audience, but really maximize that segment, right? So how can you find all those customers, as quickly as possible? How can you get them to love the game more and more? What pieces of behavior can you observe to help them over time? So I'll quickly power through this. What you really want to look at here is your retention over time by cohort. So here is a graph of day 1 and day 7 retention over time, as well as session length. And I just wanted to show quickly, again, aggregating across several apps, the difference between successful and kind of data-driven games and unsuccessful games. You can see there are broad differences in early retention behavior, and these are really important indicators to optimize on early on, so that you can quickly make decisions after 1 day or even a week of beginning to acquire users about whether you're really ready to scale. I'm actually out of time, so I'll quickly just walk through in the maturity phase that you really want to look at your monetization funnels and identify users that came in from different sources and how they're monetizing, and look for fall-off points over time for those users. And again, this is complex stuff, but we just wanted to give a high-level view of all the sorts of data you can look at over time, and how being a data-driven company can help you build better games and find a larger audience, and which sorts of indicators you should look at as your games mature through a life cycle. So just a high-level overview of the sorts of things you look at over time, and I hope it was useful as a high-level talk. Thanks everybody again for coming out so early in the morning.